The following program is being brought to you on the Voice America Empowerment Channel. For more information about our network and to check out additional show hosts and topics of interest, please visit voiceamericaempowerment.com. The Voice America Talk Radio Network is the worldwide leader in live Internet talk radio. Visit voiceamerica.com. The views and ideas expressed on the following program are strictly those of the host or guests and do not necessarily reflect the views and ideas held by the Voice America Talk Radio Network, its staff, and management.
Welcome to Living Well with Beal. Our show is a health show, a lifestyle show, and an empowerment show rolled into one. Get ready to hear some stories of success, healthy living tips, and suggestions to get motivated and live your best life. Now, here is your host, Beal.
Welcome to Living Well and the spectacular show we are going to have today. Wow, the intro talking about living a life of success and empowerment, and the guest we have today so embodies that. And I'm very excited to have a former top intelligence officer for the government, for George Bush, that worked with Colin Powell, here to tell us today why we don't need to be afraid during this holiday season. He wants you to just relax and enjoy the season, enjoy your families, and don't let the media scare you to death. And so Carl Ford Jr. is our guest today, and he is the former head of the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research under Colin Powell, and he served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Near East and Asian Affairs, and was formerly with the CIA. Welcome, Carl.
Well, and it's very nice to be here. Thank you.
Did I get that right?
Right enough.
Right enough. There's probably so much more.
Sounded good to me, that's all.
Well, and I know the last thing you did was the Assistant Secretary of State, and that was actually because Colin Powell's Secretary of State, so you were the Assistant Secretary of State, right?
Correct.
So so, you were actually born in Hot Springs, Arkansas. I found that out yesterday.
I sure was. I'm an Arkansas boy. I know this that you're down there in Dallas or someplace in Texas, so I hope that you don't hold that against me. I have lived in Hot Springs until I went to college, and then after I retired, I came back.
Yeah, but you know what? People think when they think of Arkansas, they don't think, of course, you know what? Bill Clinton's from Arkansas. Right?
That's right.
And so,
he's from Hot Springs.
You are from Hot Springs.
My same elementary school. And I don't have any recollection. He was a little bit younger than I was, and I may have pushed him down on the playground or something. But he went to the same Baptist church as my family, and my mom and dad and my sister knew him. But I was always just a step ahead and never really connected with the president.
So your family went to Emmanuel Baptist?
Park Place.
Oh, Park Place, yeah. Because, I don't know if you know, I grew up in Little Rock.
Oh, okay.
So, my family went to Emmanuel Baptist. Well, that is so exciting because I think a lot of people, when you hear what you do, it's very intimidating, all the things that you've done, and they don't realize you can start. Now, you had told me that you started college, went a couple years, and then decided that wasn't for you and joined the military, right?
Correct. I came from a working class family with middle class ambitions and values, and I simply, without the help of a very generous aunt and uncle who lived in Florida, I would never even got to go to the first 2 years of college. I didn't have enough money, and they actually adopted me, and I went and lived in their home, and then went to school at Florida State University in Tallahassee, and it was just by luck that I actually got that far. But yes, after 2 years, I decided that I had not accomplished what I wanted to. I was not doing real well, and I decided that I wanted to go in the Army, and it changed my life. I mean, from that point on, things looked up, and I was very I look back on that decision as being one of the most important I made in my life.
Well, the Army must have worked for your personality type. I mean, what would you say was it about you that made it fit so well with the Army?
You know, I had grown up in listening to uncles and cousins talk about World War II and Korea, and I very much had, as long as I can remember, I sort of wanted to be in the Army. It was something that I felt like people in Arkansas who they did, they served their country, and I found it a way of moving up, getting out of the small town working class environment and becoming a world traveler, and it was just something that I loved to do and found that I was good at. So it was a good decision for me.
And you moved right up in the Army, didn't you?
I'm sorry?
You moved right up the chain of command in the Army. Is that how it worked?
Well, I was an enlisted man. I started off as a private, and because of my 2 years in college, I was eligible to try out for officer candidate school. So after I'd been in the Army a while, I applied and was accepted to OCS. And I went to infantry OCS at Fort Benning and became a second lieutenant. And that really was another very important juncture in my career, going from an enlisted man to a young officer. And I stayed in the Army 10 years total. I had 4 to 5 years as an infantry officer, and after a tour in Vietnam, I came back and went back to school and finished. Got my bachelor's at Florida State in Asian Studies and a master's in East Asian Studies. And it turned out that the best job I could get after that was to go back into the Army. And so, but I branch transferred from infantry to military intelligence. And then went back to Vietnam again, and the best assignment out of Vietnam was one of those sort of dream assignments for me, because in college I had been an Asian specialist, particularly on China, and I'd taken Chinese language. I was never very good at it, but I took it, or it took me. And so all of a sudden I found I was sitting in a desk in Washington, D.C., in the Defense Intelligence Agency as an analyst on the Chinese military. And I had people around me that had been doing it for years and proved to be great mentors. They were more than willing to pass on their experiences and their skills. And my 4 years at DIA was one of those formative periods as an analyst where I soaked up everything I could from the people who had been there, done that before. The lady that was the head of the section had actually been following the Chinese Army since World War II in North China, and then when they moved into Korea. She had been doing it for 20 years, 25 years before I ever met her. But in any event, I did well at that because I liked to do it. And I had decided to stay in the Army full time and applied for regular Army commission and got one. I'd been a reserve officer out of OCS. And we were always in a constant bickering. We were always bickering with CIA over one thing or another. We had different views about the Chinese military than they did. And we were constantly at each other's throats. And I was surprised one day when the CIA folks called and said they'd like me to come over and work for them. And I assumed at the time that it might be they just wanted to get a burr out from under their saddle, bring me into the fold so I wouldn't be as dangerous as I was outside. But in any event, after much soul searching with my wife, who was working in the District of Columbia as a school teacher, and loved what she was doing, didn't want to move around with a soldier so much, we decided to make the leap from being a military officer to going to CIA. And I did about the same thing at CIA that I did at DIA. That is, I studied the Chinese military. And it was an opportunity to do what I call detailed basic research, of asking questions and trying to ferret out what was happening in the Chinese military, how fast it was modernizing, what was it doing, was it any good or not? Very, very long-term type questions that required, in fact, more than often we would do it as a team rather than as an individual. It's just too much to try to do for one person. But at some point, I found out that I had been recommended by CIA to be a congressional fellow. And it's a mid-career program that the Defense Department, State Department, CIA, and have, that they send officers down to the Congress for a year so that they can sort of learn how the legislative branch works. And it starts off with about, 3 months of academic work at Johns Hopkins in D.C. And then there was a person there who knew everything about the Congress and all the people there, and helped us work out a plan on honing in on who we might work for. And so we would go up, we were supposed to work 6 months on the Senate side and 6 months on the House side. And I started off on the Senate side and ended up with working for Senator John Glenn from Ohio. He at the time was the chairman of the East Asia Subcommittee. So it was a great fit for me, and I think for him, that I had a lot of Asia background, and that's what his focus was in the Senate and the Foreign Relations Committee. And about 5.5 months in, he came to me. He didn't ask. He just came to me and said, "Carl, I've talked to the director of CIA, and he's agreed that you can stay with me for a whole year." So I never, in the Congressional Fellowship Program, I never went to the House of Representatives. I just stayed in the Senate for a year. And it turned out that at the end of the year, he didn't want me to go then. And so I left CIA and joined Senator Glenn's staff on the Foreign Relations Committee, and worked with Senator Glenn and other senators on the Foreign Relations Committee on things about China, about Japan and Asia, and would take Senator Glenn and other senators on trips and various things. So it was an opportunity for me to, one, broaden my experience, but also meet a lot of people. Glenn is a national hero, and everywhere he goes, there are people who want to meet him, and he has all kinds of contacts and friends. Well, as the guy carrying the satchel walking beside him, I got to learn a lot from him. I also got to meet a lot of people, and so it was he really was responsible for everything that happened in my career after that. Without that opportunity to grow under his tutorship, and without his pushing me to be more than just a China specialist, and the contacts that I made through having the job for him, I would have gone back to CIA, and that would have been the end of it. I would have been an analyst and would have been happy and retired at CIA. But he opened up a door for more experiences that I had never imagined growing up. I never imagined, for example, I'd work on a presidential campaign and go around to the various debates and be there to prep the senator and hear sit in the audience and listen to the debate as it unfolded. And And those are things a kid from Arkansas just doesn't imagine ever doing. And but at some point, he knew and I knew that I'd reached the point where I was ready for something bigger. And some of the contacts I'd made called and said, "Do you want to come back to CIA?" And I said, "Well, doing what?" And they said, "Well, we want you to be the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia." And Glenn recognized, I certainly recognized, that was the promotion for me. And so I left the Foreign Relations Committee and rejoined the CIA. I had formally cut ties with them before, but I rejoined them again. And then we were responsible in the National Intelligence Council for doing national estimates. And my focus was on China and North Korea particularly, but that we did all kinds of estimating and dealing with long-range predictions, that sort of thing. But after a certain period of time, I got a call from the Pentagon, and it was a change of administrations, and they needed somebody to come down temporarily, they said, and sit in the seat until they could appoint someone to take over the ISA, International Security Affairs, at the Pentagon. The group of sort of the State Department that works directly for the Secretary of Defense. And so, sure, I was happy to go down for a few months. Turned out that it ended up being 4 years. I didn't leave CIA. I was always a CIA officer. I got paid by them, and it counted everything for retirement, of course. But I was working for Secretary Cheney. And he was, and I must say, he was a much different boss at Defense than he seemed to be as vice president. There have been a lot of people that noticed that he's changed. He seemed to be changed person from when we met him, because he was the greatest, most organized person I've ever been around, and really knew how to get the most out of people and knew how to build and to work large bureaucracies. He was a master at it, and I thoroughly enjoyed my 4 years there, and having worked both Asia and the Middle East by the time I left, I knew virtually every military senior leader in both areas. And so I set up a little consulting company and started working for companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and others, really trying to find out what was going on in these the various militaries, why they weren't buying their products usually, and what did they have to do to sell their products. And fortunately, my counterparts when I was at Defense were more successful than I was. And, for example, one became the Minister of Defense in Korea. And so every time I could go to Korea, I could actually just go to the top and ask him, well, why aren't you buying the F-16s? And he would always be kind enough to say, well, here's the reason, or here's what they need to do. And same way in Japan, my counterpart turned out to be a very important person in the Japanese Defense Agency, and it gave me great access there. And Taiwan, I'd worked on the Foreign Relations Committee as the Taiwan Relations Act, so I had contacts there. I really kind of enjoyed myself, made a little bit more money than I did in government, but I was traveling to Asia and Middle East. I was averaging about 12 to 13, 14 trips a year. And those are long trips. And I worked on that for 8 years during the Clinton administration. And then Secretary Powell called and wanted to know if I would like to come back into government. And as you can imagine, I said, oh, you bet. and joined him and his staff. He was building before 9/11. And it was then an opportunity to work through that very critical and important period of 9/11, the Iraq War, and all the things that happened during that period of time. So it was an amazing time and a great opportunity. So hard work, partly, but but a lot of luck and some very good mentors along the way. And a boy from Arkansas surprised even himself. But that maybe I went on too long. But that's sort of the gist of my career.
Now, you worked with Colin Powell 2.5 years right before, and up to the Iraq War, 9/11, and then the Iraq War.
That's correct. I was there before 9/11 and worked through 9/11 with him, and then through the Iraq War with him.
And that was a fascinating time. You had actually said that it's the best job you ever had, working for Colin Powell.
Part of that was because the agency that I was the head of, the Intelligence and Research Bureau at State Department, I had some of the smartest, some of the most capable people that you could ever work with. And their great strength was that State Department and INR let them stay to be experts on their region for lengthy periods of time. They didn't have to move around. They didn't have to do different kinds of assignments. They could be a German expert or a Japanese expert or a Al-Qaeda expert for their whole career if they wanted to. Now, they could do other things if they chose, but it was really the only place in the intelligence community where you had a band of very experienced, capable people who knew their regions much better than most anybody else in the intelligence community, because they've been there, they've been doing it longer, and they were up against people that had been there maybe 3 or 4 years, and they've been there 15. And there's a lot of things that you learn just through experience working in the intelligence field.
Well, and you were a part of the controversy about the Iraq War. And I know, like you talked about the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And you weren't, when you were working with Colin Powell, you weren't with the CIA, right?
No, I had retired from CIA, and when I left the Pentagon, I was a CIA officer there, and I decided to retire early and open up my consulting firm. But so when I went back, I worked directly I became a State Department officer. I was not attached to anybody else.
And that's your frustration mostly came from the CIA during the Iraq War, right?
Well, yes and no. It was CIA and DIA. The intelligence community is huge, and there are many components of it. And INR is one of the components that's part of the CIA, DIA, INR, NSA are sort of the top intelligence agencies. But NSA and DIA and CIA dwarf INR in size. I mean, they have thousands and thousands of people, and INR is relatively small. And so we are at INR. They were a current reporting operation that helped support the foreign policy of the Secretary of State, and also did a daily brief that was popular throughout the intelligence community for its how well written it was, etc. And so we were listened to when people wanted to, but we were the little guy. And when DIA and CIA teamed up and said, no, this is the way it is, it was hard for politicians, it was hard for senior officials to say, well, wait a minute, they've got thousands of people there, and Carl's only got a few hundred. Why am I going to go with him rather than go with these other two agencies? And so that when it came time to decide on the issue, a very critical issue of whether or not Saddam had restarted his nuclear weapons program, my analyst had a far different view of what was happening than CIA and DIA. And we were afforded the opportunity to tell people We told the Congress, we told the president, we told everybody else that we had real concerns about what CIA and DIA were saying. But in the end, people decided to go with the big dogs.
Well,
and I can't really blame them for that. I don't know what I would have done in their place, but I certainly know that from my experience as an intelligence officer, they were misled badly by two of the most important intelligence agencies, and that they were directly responsible for much of the problems that occurred after that. And so I really blame the intelligence community for causing much of the problems during that period.
So you believe, and that's what I think is interesting when I read the books, was that you clearly said that it was bad intelligence that was informing Colin Powell and George Bush and Dick Cheney. And that was even bad intelligence was informing the head of CIA, George Tenet, right?
Correct. Right. Well, people were saying that the key intelligence issue that drove the Iraq War was the nuclear weapons program. For 10 years after the Gulf War, the intelligence community had been saying that their program had stopped. The feeling was that they might restart it at some point, but there was no signs that it was really moving along at any major developments. And so that there was little concern, watched very closely, but there was still not very much happening there in Iraq, or so we thought. And after 9/11, based on very little information, some of it turning out to be totally wrong, we changed our mind. The intelligence committee changed its mind and said, they've restarted their nuclear weapons program. Now, this was before anybody had ever thought about going into Iraq. This was simply after 9/11, and all the fear and concern that everybody had, it impacted the intelligence community as well. And they lowered the bar in terms of evidence, I think, for making judgments. And they said that they'd restarted the program. My analysts were convinced that that was wrong, that they had not done that. And that from my perspective as a supervisor was that DI and CIA had not nearly enough information to make such an important judgment. It just wasn't there. They were putting things together that didn't need to be put together, and it was we were constantly overruled because we were the small guy. Now, after the war, it turns out my guys were right. My guys were heroes. And that CIA and DIA were wrong. And that not only had they made mistakes in analysis, but there had been things done that were not professional, that had been key determinants of what the president and the vice president, the secretary of defense, secretary of state used to decide whether they were going to go into Iraq or not. And so that without the intelligence community sort of throwing out the notion that they'd restarted the nuclear weapons program, it's hard for me to believe that the war could have happened. How you could have persuaded the Congress and the American people to go against Iraq just because they were bad guys.
They were bad guys. It's kind of like...
It was the fear of the nuclear weapons in the hands of terrorists that really drove people to be fearful of what might happen in Iraq. But there weren't any.
I think
the intelligence community should have known it.
Well, and I think that when you think about 9/11 and the extreme reactions to 9/11 and the fears, they're kind of similar now with ISIS. ISIS hasn't blown up buildings or anything like that, but the Al-Qaeda fears, when if you think of the way people feel about Putin and trying to convince us that Putin doesn't have nuclear weapons or whatever, and you can think about the way they felt about. It sounds like the community the intelligence community went way extreme the other direction. and was not doing things the way they normally had done it before or as detailed as they'd done it before. It's almost like they were all just scared and reacting to fear. Well, and
I think that's certainly part of it.
And they weren't really very logical and rational, but you guys seem to stay logical and rational, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, because when we talk about the fears that a lot of people have watching the news about Al-Qaeda and all that, you guys are very grounded. You've been very grounded, and you were right. And you're a Middle East specialist. And so for us to hear you talk to us about now, which we'll do in the last segment, really is comforting. And so we're going to take a break. And when we get back, we want to talk more about your views on today and some of your things that would help us be able to relax more and enjoy the holiday season. Is that okay?
Happy to.
Okay, we'll be right back with Living Well.
Thank you.
Follow us on Twitter for more great ideas at Voice America Empowerment.
Life Solutions Coaching and Counseling in Fort Worth, Texas is a full-service wellness clinic providing individual, group, and family counseling, one-on-one coaching for life and wellness, and naturopathic treatments of medical massage therapy combined with essential oils to ensure you reach your health and wellness goals. Sessions are available in person or by phone. Get started on your new life today. Just call 817-232-1363 or go to LifeSolutionsCoachingandCounseling.com or email them at lifesolutionscc@yahoo.com.
We're all living in the moment, but you never know when life is going to take a unique turn. It doesn't have to be a challenge, but perhaps more of a detour to get where we need to be. On The Sky's the Limit, host Karen Levitt knows that experience, having faced it herself. Learn about her journey from a life-changing event to where she is now. Her guests are amazing people who are living these experiences and overcoming obstacles. Learn from their stories every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time on Voice America Empowerment.
We're on Facebook along with some of the greatest minds of the world, and that includes you. Visit us on Facebook at Voice America Empowerment.
You are listening to Living Well with Ann Beal. We'd love to hear from you with comments and questions about the show. Please send us an email to ablivingwell@gmail.com. That's ablivingwell@gmail.com. Now, back to this week's show.
Welcome back. We have our surprise guest today, continuing about why we just need to relax over the holiday season and just enjoy our families and not worry about all the fears that the news throws at us, and that it's just sensationalism to keep us watching, so they do keep us afraid. And we have Carl Ford Jr., the former Assistant Secretary of State of Intelligence, the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research with Colin, who worked with Colin Powell. Here to, and he's been talking to us a lot about the past 15, 20 years in intelligence and where we are today with Al-Qaeda. And we were just talking about the Iraq War and the miscommunication, bad intelligence coming from the CIA and the DIA that influenced George Bush and Colin Powell and all of them to go into Iraq. But Carl Ford Jr. and his, is that the INR? The intelligence, what's the INR?
Intelligence and Research.
Intelligence and Research. You guys consulted them to not go in. And that they didn't have, because it sounded like when you told me all the things you told me the last few days, it sounded like a lot of circumstantial evidence, no real clear, true, detailed research and actually fact-finding that, they used to do to actually make sure that all their rumors and information were true. Instead, they were going on a lot of rumor and fears with some circumstantial evidence. Is that right?
Yes, I think I'd like to correct, though, that I didn't tell them they shouldn't go into Iraq.
Oh, you didn't?
My agency and many of my analysts believe that. In fact, I had one analyst who, out of conscience, left the government because of Iraq. But what we were saying was that they have not restarted their nuclear weapons program. All of the things that you're hearing about weapons of mass destruction is greatly exaggerated, and that before you act, you better take that into consideration. There's not nearly enough evidence to suggest what CIA and DI are telling you. That's basically where we were at.
Yeah, because he did have the biological weapons already, and the bacterial weapons and things like that. I mean, they knew he had other weapons. They just didn't think he had mass destruction weapons earlier, right?
Well, and it turned out we thought that they had kept their chemical and their biological programs at a very low level, and that they might even have chemical warheads and possibly biological warheads. But it turns out they didn't have any of that. That they, after the Gulf War, Saddam decided that because of all the pressure on Iraq from the rest of the world, that he was going to have to stop for a moment, because he never gave up his ambition to have the nuclear weapons mass destruction, but he was smart enough to realize that he was going to have to stop, so he did. And he stopped everything.
But he didn't tell anybody.
We missed that. We didn't catch that.
Yeah. Well, and he was acting like he had a lot of things. And I think that one of the things you said, that Colin Powell said to you when you gave him your opinion, which was different than what the CIA and the DIA were telling him, which were, again, thousands of analysts telling him they did have weapons of mass destruction. And you guys were saying, no. Colin Powell said, well, if that's true, why doesn't Saddam Hussein tell us that? You know, and he wasn't telling you guys that. He was making it sound like he did have them, right?
Yeah, and there was, for Saddam, admitting that he had buckled under to the pressure from the Americans and to the West in general, was and given up his deterrent of nuclear weapons and chemical and biological, could have caused his military and intelligence folks, or could have prompted a coup. And he knew that many people might be upset about what he's done. He also had to worry about Israel and us. He was wanting to keep up at least the facade of a deterrent without actually having to have the programs. And so admitting it to us was something that was a very difficult thing for him to do. But Colin Powell was a person of high integrity, and I greatly respect him. And he always was asked INR, what do you think? And he gave us an opportunity to tell him what we thought, and why we agreed or disagreed with other agencies. And I always respected that I knew that we could go and say, well, we could go get right to him and say, no, watch out, boss, that's not right. But when it came to this, it was such a big decision, and everybody was so adamant on the other side that it was very difficult, I think. I certainly don't hold it against him, of not accepting INR's view. He asked for it. We gave it to him. He looked at it very carefully, and George Tenet and CIA convinced him we were wrong. and
that really changed his life, didn't it? I mean, I think that you can tell he's different now, and I would think that for him, that's part of that, being the 4-star general and being Secretary of State, having to make those kinds of decisions when you're sending in Americans to fight, and you're heading up such a huge war effort. I think that it had to have wounded him immensely that the intelligence was wrong. And I mean, more than that, right? I don't even know how you can compare, but I do think it had to have changed him, because he trusted, the intelligence. And it seems like most people, when we see, like, most of us, we see James Bond and we think, the intelligence community has all these agents all over the world and they know everything. And they would know if Saddam Hussein was just full of, junk and just making it look like that. They would know that. I think as Americans, we think we know everything because we have these agents everywhere. When you think about the intelligence community, we don't realize there's so much we really don't know, and there's a lot of guessing. And so when we do make mistakes, I mean, it can be a really horrible thing. And I'm glad to have your perspective on that about what really happened, because there's some books out there that just look like, and I told you, it looks like MSNBC wrote the book. It's just like all the talking points you hear, depending on which political person is talking. And so, and the slant. And so it's so good to hit your perspective. Now you teach I know you were teaching at George Mason University, and you were teaching at
Georgetown.
Georgetown. And the executive branch decision-making classes, right?
Correct.
And then you were also teaching on intelligence and weapons of mass destruction.
Correct. I did executive decision-making, executive branch decision-making at Georgetown, and a graduate seminar. And then a graduate seminar at George Mason. I taught a course on national intelligence.
Well, and I think most people don't understand how the executive branch makes decisions, and I think having a professor like you would be incredible, especially learning about the intelligence side, just everything. And I know now you're actually teaching classes in Hot Springs, right?
Correct, and very much enjoying it. I work at National Park College and teach political science to freshmen and sophomore kids. And
it's wonderful. Are you there? Is it wonderful?
Yeah, I'm here.
You like it? You like working with these kids, don't you?
Oh, sure. I mean, they come from the same sort of backgrounds that I did, and I really feel like I'm giving back, helping if I can, and a lot of these students don't have all the advantages that others have, and so being able to help them gives me great pleasure.
Well, can you tell us a little bit, if you bring it to today and we talk about Al-Qaeda? I know one of the things you said to me about terrorism is that we really don't need to be afraid.
Well, I think that we obviously have to be concerned about terrorism as a worldwide problem, and we have to be concerned about ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call it, and the remnants of Al-Qaeda, the few people out there that still are messing around. But I think that we have to keep that in perspective and understand what the threat is and how best to deal with that threat. I start with looking at what does ISIL want us to do. What they have written down their strategy, for example, and one of the major goals of ISIL is to convince the West, the U.S., Europe, to become more anti-Muslim. It's not to form a caliphate. It's not to take over the world. It's to get the United States and others to be anti-Islamic. And the reason is because that gives them a broader recruiting base. It gives them a broader base to raise money. And so for them, that's their goal. They want us to be terrified. That's what terror is all about. So when you are terrified, you're letting them win. You're walking right into what they're trying to get you to do. So I think we as Americans have to keep in perspective how that dangerous that threat is. I mean, World War II and the Greatest Generation, that was a real threat. The Cold War was a real threat. But ISIL is a threat, but not something that we have to go to bed at night worrying about. The fact is that 45 people have been killed since 9/11, and by terrorists in the United States, so about 45. And we don't get into our car every day and drive off to the grocery store worrying about drunk drivers or speeders. We just get in and we drive. We know there's a risk. We know there's a danger. We know that it's not completely safe, but we don't obsess about it. We drive carefully. We follow the rules. We watch out for other people, and they're not following the rules. So we have people that, far more people that die of cancer and various other illnesses. All of these problems, in my mind, are things that we worry that cause more problems or more serious problems than ISIL is. So we have to keep it in perspective. FBI says if you see anything, tell. Say. And I think that's a good advice. But the fact is that the chances of an American citizen being killed by a terrorist is probably somewhere on the order of winning the Arkansas and Georgia lottery on the same weekend. Okay,
yeah,
and it's possible, but very remote. And when we are terrified, we're letting them win. And I think we just have to be able to stand up and say, as Americans, we're not going to change our system. We're not going to let this band of thugs make us do things that we as Americans don't believe in. And we're going to deal with you guys. You have made the biggest mistake in the world of messing around with us and France and Germany and Saudi Arabia and various other people. Now, because remember, the problem of terrorism is much greater for people in the Middle East. I mean, they're the ones that have to face it every day. Watch on TV and look at what's happened in Syria. Whole cities have been decimated. People are streaming out of Syria because they're so afraid. Now, they have to worry and obsess about terrorism. That's something very real. But for us, we need to be resolved. We need to be determined, but we don't need to be terrified. And when we do, we simply are walking into the trap of doing exactly what they want us to do. Now, I also feel when someone tells you that they can keep you safe, my own view is that they either are terribly misleading you or they don't know what they're talking about. The fact is that we have very good police, FBI, intelligence community, but guess what? Those people are human. They have to work within the bounds of what's possible. When someone says they can keep you safe, they're basically saying, in effect, we can, before there is a kidnapping, we can stop it. Before there is a bank robbery, we can stop it. Before there is a drunk driver, we can stop it. Those are things that happen. That's part of life. And we can guard against it, but we can't just simply believe that there's some magic formula that will keep us safe. We have to be vigilant, but don't ruin your Christmas. Don't ruin your New Year. Worry about this stuff.
And I think that one of the things that you said that made me feel good after talking to you was that, Al-Qaeda is not big enough. They're just not big enough for our country. They can't. They're small. And, like when you were talking about Russia and China and some real threats, that we've had in the past, even now, they're bigger, that Al-Qaeda is not and ISIS is not. And part of their reason wanting us to be anti-Muslim or anti-Islam or anti-Islam would be to recruit over there in other countries. They're worried about, they want to recruit over there. And you were saying, like, changing. They want to change Saudi Arabia. They want to change Jordan, Syria, Iraq. They want to change places like that. And we don't need to change our policies because somebody has a bomb in their tennis shoe or a bomb in their underwear. And then we don't need to be afraid because of California that changing policies for such small things.
No more than we have to be afraid when we get on an airplane. We always know that when we get on a plane, it could crash. We see them occasionally on TV, and it's a danger. But that doesn't stop us from flying. This little band of thugs ought not to be able to stop us being Americans, and who are strong, believe in liberty and freedom, and have the people. This group can't win. It can cause all kinds of problems, but it can't win. The only way, and as you said, is that if it can get Jordan to fall, if it can get Syria and Iraq to fall, they're more concerned about the Arab Muslim world than they are us. But if you want to get support, you talk about this terrible monster, the United States, and that they are against Islam. They're not against us. They're not against our atrocities. They are against our religion. Well, that's not true, and we ought not to let them get away with that. We simply shouldn't let our freedoms be used against us in a way that helps the terrorist. I just, well, enough. My own sense is that this is something that we are going to have to live with, but remember, it's not the threat that people are talking about, that you shouldn't be afraid to go out. Closing the schools in Los Angeles, for example, over an email. That was a victory for ISIL. Wow. Right. Boy, can you imagine what they were talking about last night in Syria, and how many backslaps and various other things? They had nothing to do with that, okay? I would bet money they had nothing to do with it. But they're going to take credit for it, and they great pleasure, because we jumped when they pulled our string. And I think we're better than that. We faced Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. We faced the Soviet Union. We could certainly face this little dinky band of thugs called ISIL.
Right. I mean, Hitler killed millions. I mean, millions, not hundreds, And so when you think about that, but the media has taken it to a whole new level with this 24/7 media coverage. I mean, California, as you said, was on all day long, nonstop, on CNN, MSNBC, it's just on and on and on. And they just throw it at us, and they need fear to keep us watching. So they terrify us to keep us watching. If it was boring and it was peaceful and it was calm and enjoyable, people would turn it off and go live their lives and then come back and turn it on. But they don't want you to do that. They want you to watch all the time. And you're not going to do that unless you're terrified.
Well, and they certainly promote the fear by the round-the-clock coverage and exaggerating, in my mind, the actual threat. There was probably somewhere in America on that day that there could have been a horrendous car crash that killed 14 people, that 3 cars and a tractor trailer. We wouldn't even hear about that.
Right.
That's what is more serious. Those are things that happen more often and are more dangerous than worrying about a few terrorists that may slip into the United States. You've got good FBI. You've got good police. They're looking. And they're going to catch most of them. But they're not going to be able to guarantee you that they'll catch every one of them. And just like they can't guarantee you that they can stop every kidnapping before it occurs. We're human. We have tools that work very well, but we cannot read people's minds. We cannot. People do things at the spur of the moment. Even if we've been watching them, they can do things so quickly that we can't react.
And I think it's important that really we let people know, turn off TV. I mean, you can get informed and turn it off. You can read and turn it in. And so for people, because I have so many clients that are anxiety-ridden, that are so fearful. Of course, we have the preppers, and there's so many people that are just terrified and ruled by this fear. And that if you can just get them to turn off all the media and just enjoy their lives, enjoy the holidays, and they can read. I mean, the thing about the paper before the 24/7 news was that you could put the paper down. It only had an article or two, and so people need to get control back of their lives and stop letting the media control them. And that's really one of the things that I want to recommend for people who are fear-based. It is amazing if you just turn it off. I turned it off a really long time ago, and I get my information from reading and then putting it away. And if it starts to scare me when you live in fear, then you're going to make so many mistakes financially, emotionally, just everywhere, and relationship-wise. You don't want to live your life in fear. And I know for you, Carl, that was one of the things that was your biggest thing you wanted to talk about, was the fear of terrorism and how it's not real.
Well, terrorism is a threat. And we have to be vigilant. We have to have, in my mind, we have to have a better strategy on dealing with them. But that's a separate issue from how the American people react to terrorism. They are, in my mind, being given the threat is being exaggerated, both by the government and by the media, and I'm not sure why. I mean, it seems to me that it's important for us to deal with this problem, but we don't want to. People were talking last night on the debate about being strong, about being tough.
That's what
we got to do this. You know what I would say? We got to be smart. The first thing to do is be smart, and that if we're smart and we use our great ingenuity and our track record as a country, we'll deal with this, and it will be a blip on the screen of American history. It'll get a paragraph or two in the history book rather than a full chapter as World War II gets,
I like that. A blip on the screen, a paragraph or two in history books. That's what we want it to be, and we can make it that. And you have let us know so much about how to enjoy our holidays. Thank you so much for being on, Carl.
Well, it was my pleasure and my honor. I thank you very much, Ann. I hope I was helpful to you.
Oh, God, incredibly helpful. You have a great holiday, and thank you for honoring us today by being on. And everyone else out there, have a great holiday. We'll see you next week for our Christmas show, and just enjoy getting ready for the holidays. Live well.
Thank you again for joining us. Living Well with Ann Beal airs live every Wednesday morning at 7 a.m. Pacific Time, 10 a.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Empowerment Channel. We can't wait to see you again next week.